Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Chippewa Falls in beautiful western Wisconsin, and welcome to Hidden Chippewa Valley. I am your host, John Kinville, and 100 years ago today, on December 20th, 1924, in fact, at this very time, what happened on this railroad bridge that belonged to the Soo Line Railroad is going to rattle this city, shock a nation, and destroy the lives of countless families. I hope you will join me and watch to the end, because there are some twists and turns as we uncover this piece of hidden Chippewa Valley. I want to take a moment and thank Joe Lee, who's the owner of the Muffler Shop, located in downtown Chippewa Falls on 17 Taylor Street. Joe and his team sponsored this video. When I went up to him and said, hey, I'd like to do some kind of a YouTube channel, he said, well, I'd like to be your first sponsor. So Joe, thank you so much. The folks down at the Muffler Shop handle all my vehicles. They've serviced my Caravan, my Journey, and he even worked on my 1981 DeLorean of all things. So for all your automotive needs, go ahead and call Joe Lee at the Muffler Shop in downtown Chippewa Falls. Even if you need an oil change, Joe's the man for you. Thanks again, Muffler Shop. I appreciate it.
On a frigidly cold winter morning on December 20th, 1924, a Soo Line Railroad passenger train filled mostly with Christmas and business travelers steamed out of the Minneapolis train station, on time at 7:45 a.m. Arrival at Oshkosh, Wisconsin was set for 4:45 p.m. that afternoon, with the train continuing to its final destination in Chicago. Years later in the 1950s, this route will become affectionately known as the Laker, as the train was an homage to the 27,000 combined lakes found in Minnesota and Wisconsin, as well as the two Great Lakes, Superior and Michigan, on each end of the train's route in Duluth and Chicago. Similar to the train shown here at Chippewa Falls years earlier, the December 20th train comprised of 3 U.S. Mail and Railroad Express mail cars, 1 baggage car, 2 passenger coaches, 1 sleeping car, and 1 combination cafe observation car. Pulling the December 20th train was a new coal-fired steam engine, numbered 2719. Built in New York State in 1923 by the American Locomotive Company, 2719 was a 4x6x2 style engine, meaning 4 leading wheels on 2 axles in the front, 6 powered and coupled driving wheels in the middle, and 2 trailing wheels on 1 axle in the rear. Engineering 2719 on December 20th, 1924, was 45-year-old Harry J. Caldwell. Even though the married father of 3 was based out of and living in Minneapolis, he was originally from the Chippewa Falls area, born in a northern township called Eagle Point. Assisting Caldwell that day were fireman Roy Kokoski, brakeman John Stewart, and flagman Harold Richmond, all 3 from Stevens Point, Wisconsin. Also on board was conductor John Ray from Oshkosh. He collected tickets and attended to the general needs of the passengers. Rounding out the train's crew were 2 African-American men living in St. Paul, Minnesota. 40-year-old John Lewis worked as the train's porter, or sleeping car attendant, while 35-year-old Sam Curtis served as the cook in the train's rear cafe observation car. Before working for the Soo Line, Curtis served in the U.S. Army as a cook in the 804th Pioneer Infantry Unit, an all-black unit. Sent to France during World War I, Sam Curtis in the 804th, shown here in this rare unit photo, provided an invaluable service role to the frontline battle units during the war. At 12:30 p.m., running roughly 1 hour behind schedule, train 2719 rolled into the western edge of Chippewa Falls at the Irvine Rail Yard. Engineer Caldwell followed the normal protocol and increased his speed from the 15 miles an hour in the yard to 25 miles per hour. To properly navigate the upcoming 6-degree turn and the track's 3% grade increase leading up to the Chippewa River Bridge. From Irvine Yard, it was approximately 1.5 miles to the recently built Soo Line Depot, built atop the river levee parallel to Canal Street on the city's south side. The passenger platform and the depot's foundation can still be seen today across the street from Sweeney's Bar and Grill. What happened next would rattle a city, shock the nation, and lay ruin to numerous families. As 2719 left Irvine Yard at 12:32 p.m., the train passed over a switch several hundred feet before the bridge that split the route between the mainline track and a spur that paralleled the river going into downtown Chippewa Falls. Caldwell carefully guided the engine and train cars over the switch as the train continued its rightward path up and onto the Chippewa River Railroad High Bridge. Constructed in 1918, the steel Warren Truss-style bridge has a deck-top design, utilizing steel equilateral triangles for weight distribution underneath. The bridge itself extends 771 total feet, including near-matching concrete arches on each end, with the main structure consisting of 5 steel spans supported by 4 concrete piers. With the engine already having crossed the bridge and making the left-hand turn towards the depot on the levee, Engineer Caldwell and the rest of the crew felt a lurch and heard the roar of escaping steam coming from the train. Someone in the rear had applied the air brakes in emergency fashion. As Caldwell closed the throttle and slowed the train to a halt, Fireman Kokoski broke the disturbing news to the engineer that the combination cafe observation car had broken off and crashed into the icy river. At 12:34 p.m., with air temperatures in Chippewa Falls at a sub-zero minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the cafe observation combination car had broken away from the rest of the train, left the track, and plunged some 60 feet into the fast-moving and icy Chippewa River current below. Having landed nearly parallel to the bridge on the eastern side of the structure, the car landed on its roof, mostly submerged in 7 feet of water, leaving only part of the car and its trucks and wheels jetting outwards above the river's waterline. Within 30 minutes, workers upriver at the Lake Wissota hydroelectric dam closed the gates, reducing the depth of the Chippewa River by 2 feet, which exposed even more of the train car and giving rescuers and searchers greater access below. Inside the car was a chaotic rush of freezing water, mixed with a violent amalgamation of tumbled diningware, food, personal belongings, furniture, and the bodies of 15 human beings, including 2 railroad employees and 13 passengers. By all accounts, it was a miracle that anyone survived at all, had it not been for the heroic and spontaneous actions of several people, including Chippewa Falls firefighters who dangled ladders from the bridge down below to the car, railroad employees, and close witnesses that minimized the death toll. In particular, 2 Chippewa Falls teenagers who witnessed the wreck as it happened live, Raymond Walther, age 17, and Dayton Gagne, age 15, sprung into action and found a small boat nearby and rowed it out to the site, and helped shuttle people to shore, giving up their mittens, coats, and hats to female survivors who later credited the youth with saving their lives. Most notable of the rescuers that day were arguably porter John Lewis and cook Sam Curtis, the 2 African-American railroad employees and the only railroad employees inside the car. Both men displayed poise and courage under pressure, despite their own physical injuries, and quickly mobilized their efforts to evacuate the passengers from the rail car. Wreck survivor Harry Jones from Iowa was quoted as saying, "The 2 Negroes swimming about throughout the car lifting up the survivors above the waterline to ensure that none of them sank down or drowned. Without their valiant efforts," Jones surmised, "the death count would have been much higher." A Minneapolis paper reported that cook Sam Curtis, the former military veteran, remained atop the submerged railway car despite being drenched and freezing, assisting those who attempted to escape and refused to leave until everyone was accounted for. Of the 15 people involved in the wreck, 7 survived, 8 perished. Of the deceased, 3 were Canadian and 5 were American. One victim was a Canadian named Kenneth Anderson, age 37, of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. An insurance agent by trade, Kenneth was traveling to his mother's house in Detroit, Michigan for Christmas. Waiting for him there were his wife and 2 children, who had arrived in Detroit several weeks earlier. Kenneth initially was able to escape the overturned car by swimming through a window and endeavored to swim to shore. Just shy of the riverbank, Kenneth went numb, disappeared beneath the surface, and was eventually hauled out of the water by rescuers on shore. He later died from exposure. A second victim was a Canadian named Robert Sharp, age 68, of Vancouver, British Columbia. Robert was a successful entrepreneur who had served 14 years as president of the Pacific Box Company. Robert was in the beginning stage of an extended business trip to the east coast of the United States. He died from a combination of exposure and injuries from the fall. A third victim was a Canadian named John Patrick Dunn, age 64. John was the most prominently known of all of the victims, as he was internationally known to be a traveling lecturer for the Knights of Columbus of Canada, a Catholic-based fraternal order. Recognized as the father of the Knights of Columbus of Ontario, John was traveling back to his residence on Manhattan Island in New York City, where he was looking forward to spending Christmas with his wife Louise and 10 children. Dunn was initially rescued from the car, but died from exposure shortly after arriving at St. Joseph's Hospital on Chippewa Falls' West Hill. A fourth victim was an American named Florence Hayes, age 36, of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Florence was a widowed elementary school teacher who was traveling with her father to visit relatives for Christmas in Berlin, Wisconsin. By all accounts, Florence died immediately as a result of the initial fall. Her lifeless body was found inside the rail car, submerged under the water, under a piece of furniture and other debris. A fifth victim was an American named Charles Pardo, age 65, of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Charles was a druggist and was one of the founders of the financially successful business Northwestern Drug Company in Minneapolis. He was a widow who was traveling with his daughter and fellow train victim Florence Hayes to Berlin, Wisconsin, for that visit with the family. Unlike his daughter, Charles survived the initial crash, only to perish about an hour later from exposure and injuries at St. Joseph's Hospital in Chippewa. A sixth victim was an American named Amber Jones, age 40, of Sioux City, Iowa. Amber and her husband were traveling to Oshkosh, Wisconsin to spend Christmas with her side of the family. Together they operated a resort back in Sioux City. Harry recalled how the couple held hands as the car wheels jumped the track and began riding and hopping the railroad ties. After being initially dazed from the crash, Harry recalled trying to stay afloat inside the car. His last memory before losing consciousness and then waking up in the hospital was climbing up 2 steep banks on the shoreline while wet and freezing. Amber was not as fortunate and was likely killed upon impact. A seventh victim was an American named May Morse, age 25, of Aberdeen, South Dakota. The newly engaged school teacher was traveling to Stevens Point, Wisconsin to spend Christmas with her family. Her lifeless body was pulled from the wreck, and the only visible injury on her body was a cut on her forehead. It was believed that she lost consciousness after hitting her head on impact and drowned in the frigid water that had enveloped the car. The final victim was also the youngest, an American infant named Barbara Spencer, aged just 5 months and 23 days, of Seattle, Washington. Born to passenger survivors Matthew and Helen Spencer, the family of 3 was traveling to Appleton, Wisconsin, to spend Christmas with Helen's family. The infant's father, Matthew, was prominent in college academia and currently served as the head of the University of Washington School of Journalism. Helen was holding Barbara as the car careened off the bridge, but lost grip of her as the car inverted upside down. Both parents frantically searched the icy waters, even though they were injured, to no avail. Barbara's lifeless body was found, and the last victim reported. News of the wreck made the front page of nearly every newspaper in America, covering coast to coast from Los Angeles to New York. Differing reports on the final death toll seemed to be the biggest discrepancy within the news coverage of the event. With both human rescue and body recovery efforts completed, the Soo Line Railroad began the process of clearing the wreck site. 2 railroad cranes and their crews were dispatched to Chippewa Falls from Stevens Point the following day to fish out the railroad car from the river. With no major systemic damage done to either the bridge or the track itself, normal train service resumed as soon as the wreck was removed. Up on the west hill of the city, St. Joseph Hospital was now home to both the deceased and the survivors. The basement morgue housed the corpses of the 8 deceased, as officials waited for families to provide direction for their shipment home. For the 7 survivors, all of them American, each was mending at a different pace. All of them were suffering from extreme weather exposure, amongst other ailments. The first survivor was Harry Jones, age 38, from Sioux City, Iowa. He was still in shock from losing his wife Amber while trying to mend from mostly cuts and bruises. A second survivor was Matthew Spencer, age 42, from Seattle, Washington. He was grieving the loss of his infant daughter, Barbara, while also healing from 2 broken ribs, numerous bruises, and frostbite on his hands. A third survivor was Helen Spencer, age 33, also from Seattle, Washington. She was devastated from the loss of her daughter, Barbara, like her husband, and seemed to blame herself for the death of the infant. Helen was nursing frostbitten hands and several bruises. A fourth survivor was AlmaBX, age 31, from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. She was a homemaker and the wife of Paul Blixt, a Soo Line railroad engineer. She was heading home from Minneapolis where she had been visiting family. She nearly died from her injuries as a piece of wooden wall molding broke free from the car and speared into her thigh. A fifth survivor was Marion Lawson, age 33, from Menasha, Wisconsin. A schoolteacher by trade, she was traveling home to Menasha for Christmas with her family. In addition to suffering from exposure, Marion was being treated for an extreme case of mental shock. The last 2 survivors were John Lewis, the porter, and Sam Curtis, the cook. The 2 African-American men were the only Soo Line employees involved directly in the wreck. Both men were treated for cuts, bruises, and extreme weather exposure. As for the cause of the wreck, careful inspection of the track leading up to the bridge had shown a problem with the switch. The railroad believed that a switch bolt that secured a connecting rod, held in by a cotter pin, similar to the one pictured here, crystallized from the extreme cold and broke free. The result was that the switch was unable to hold its place as train 2719 passed over it. Thus, the final set of wheels in the last truck of the Cafe Observation combination car hopped off the track and proceeded to roll on the outside of the rails on the wooden ties. Once too much of the car's leverage was off the track, the force sent the railroad car plunging off the bridge to its demise. Other theories were brought forward too, including one hypothesizing employee maintenance error by those working on the ground at the Irvine rail yard. Was the improper or forgotten bolt installment the cause? Another theory suspected third-party sabotage, either by a would-be criminal or even a teenage prank gone awry. Complicating matters was that the switch bolt and cotter pin, or remnants thereof, were nowhere to be found. Then on December 23rd, 3 days later, a closed-door inquiry in Stevens Point sought to finalize the cause of the wreck. In attendance were Soo Line corporate leadership, Wisconsin railroad officials, and Chippewa District Attorney Harold E. Stafford. Prior to the trip to Stevens Point, Stafford had expressed some concern as to why no remnants of the bolt could be found. After the meeting in Stevens Point, however, all parties left in agreement that there was no evidence to suggest any crime had taken place, and that the most likely cause of the switch malfunction was the extreme cold crystallization and snapping of the switch bolt. Both the Irvine yard crew and the 2719 train crew were exonerated from any wrongdoing. The matter was officially closed. As Christmas came and went and the New Year approached, the Soo Line train wreck at Chippewa Falls inched away from public attention. But not for one Minneapolis man. On the afternoon of New Year's Eve, 1924, on another bitterly cold winter day, engineer Harry Caldwell returned home from settling all his debts with some area shopkeepers. He quietly ate dinner with his family, then proceeded down to the basement for an after-dinner smoke. As the 45-year-old brooded over the loss of life at Chippewa Falls and the end to his perfect record as an engineer with the Soo Line for 20 years, he couldn't stop blaming himself for what happened at Chippewa Falls. Despite the fact that he did nothing wrong, his own mind could not let it rest. A half hour after watching her dad enter the basement, 19-year-old daughter Lois found him hanging from a beam with a clothesline wrapped around his neck. Porter John Lewis continued to work for the Soo Line and lived out the rest of his days in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was a proud member of the Freemasonic fraternity belonging to Pioneer Lodge No. 1, shown above. His wife Lillian was a prominent hand and foot doctor in the region. He died from a heart attack in 1948 at the age of 63 and was buried in Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul. Railroad cook Sam Curtis, who refused to leave the wrecked car until everyone was accounted for, retired from the Soo Line and lived out his remaining years in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Curtis got to live to see many social advances throughout America, most notably through civil rights gains for African Americans. He succumbed to heart disease in 1969 at the age of 79 and was buried with his fellow veterans at Fort Snelling National Cemetery in Minneapolis. The last remaining survivor of the wreck, AlmaBX, died in 1996 at the age of 102. Outside the railroad bridge itself, the only remaining witness to the wreck, if you will, is steam engine 2719. Once it was retired, the engine was put on static public display in Eau Claire's Carson Park for 37 years. In 1996, it was refurbished and ran again for many years. Today, the engine is on static display at the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth, Minnesota.
Thank you for joining me on my first episode of Hidden Chippewa Valley, Death Train at Chippewa Falls. Our next episode is going to come from Eau Claire, where I'm going to explore the mysterious death of a lumber baron who's entombed there. In the meantime, if you like this story, if you could subscribe to my channel, like this video, and share it with somebody who's interested in Chippewa Valley history. You see, together, we become witnesses to the past and keep their stories alive. Thanks again, happy holidays, and Merry Christmas. Oh, geez. Look at all these burrs and seeds stuck to my pants.